All right, in social studies, we are going to take a look at how nationalist loyalties can end up creating conflict. Specifically, what we're going to take a look at today is mostly we're going to take a look at Quebec, but we're also going to see a bit of Newfoundland's challenges existing within Canada in order to see how national loyalties can come into conflict. Sometimes people's loyalties are compatible with each other. They can coexist and work together. However, sometimes the goals of people's different national identities can come into conflict with one another as well. And this is when people start to get their loyalty tugged on for either side. For Newfoundland, there's a don't want to minimize it, but compared to some other conflicts, fairly low-key one that we can think about. July 1st is Canada Day for the rest of the country. However, for Newfoundland, it's also one of the bloodiest days in its history. During World War I, Newfoundland was not actually a part of Canada yet. It was its own self-governed part of the British Empire. So when Newfoundlanders went off to fight in World War I, there was a single Newfoundlander regiment that fought throughout the war. And at the Battle of Beaumont-Hamel, it was pretty much wiped out. An entire generation of soldiers were either killed or wounded in about 30 minutes. So for Newfoundland, Canada Day can be celebrated and is celebrated by some people, but it is also a somber day because that battle took place on July 1st and it's actually their Memorial Day. The battle is just as important for Newfoundlanders as Vimy Ridge is for Canadians in general. And there is a tension between the celebration of Canada Day and the memory and somberness of Memorial Day just happening to fall on the same day. So that is a place where there can be some tension between loyalties, because how does one celebrate and reflect on that day? And different people will come up with different ways of reconciling those conflicting loyalties. The biggest probably within Canada for contending loyalties is, of course, the question about Quebecois separatism. There is a very strong tension between the Canadian and Quebecois loyalty within the province. In general, we can think of two primary camps. Now, remember, we're putting people into opposite sides of an argument here, but this is not actually a black and white thing. People exist on a spectrum, a continuum between these two ends. So, on one side, you have the sovereignists who believe that Quebec should be an independent nation and or nation state. They want to separate from Canada, and they want Quebec's nationhood to be something that is internationally recognized and to have control over their own destinies because of it. Federalists, on the other hand, argue that Quebec is a part of Canada, that it should remain a part of the province, and that Quebecois identity is actually inseparable from Canada itself because of how Quebec and the Quebecois are tied into Canadian history. So there's obviously a tension between those two points of views. They want mutually exclusive things. The sovereignists have an idea of Quebecois loyalty and identity that involves self-determination, and the Federalists have an idea of Quebecois loyalty that reconciles with Canadian loyalty. So we're going to take a look at two flashpoints for these issues. The first of those is the FLQ crisis. And both of these two flashpoints, I'm just going to go over in very general details. They are very complicated events. So don't take this as the be-all and end-all discussion of either of these flashpoints. So the FLQ crisis, or the October crisis, because it took place in October 1970, occurred when members of a group that called itself FLQ, Front de Libération du Québec, kidnapped a visiting British trade minister, then abducted and murdered Quebec's deputy premier. The FLQ was a separatist terrorist organization. They had been responsible for bombing the Montreal Stock Exchange a few years earlier, and by this point, most of the cells of the FLQ had disbanded, but two of them were still kicking around, and they carried out this plot to abduct some people and use that as leverage to try and force the dismissal and the dissolution of Quebec's provincial government, and eventually force out Anglo-Canadians from Quebec and make Quebec into its own separate nation state. The crisis did lead Pierre Elliott Trudeau to invoke the Wartime Measures Act, which didn't quite declare martial law within Ontario and Quebec because the military was still subservient to the civil government, to the federal government and the provincial government, but it did give extremely wide-ranging powers, and it moved the military into both provinces to try and shut down the FLQ. There has been a lot of debate about whether the murder of the deputy premier was intentional or not. Most historians these days come down on the side of the cell that had abducted him panicked, and quite possibly that he died unintentionally. But certainly that most historians now agree that it was not premeditated. They hadn't intended to kill him, but regardless, the murder of the deputy premier led to the FLQ specifically, and violence associated with separatism in Quebec, to lose a lot of public support. And part of the consequence of that was the rise of the Parti Québécois and the Bloc Québécois as separatist political parties. These sovereignists would attempt instead to gain independence for Quebec through political action, rather than trying to use violence or revolution in order to force it through. That leads in then to our second flashpoint. 25 years later, the Parti Québécois finally got the support they needed. They were in power at the time to put separatism to a vote in Quebec. And this is also, again, I'm simplifying this significantly, but this is also one of the big launching points for the Bloc Québécois as well. It was initially projected that the separatists would easily be defeated, but it came basically within 1%, a 50-49 split. If you're familiar with the Brexit vote, it's pretty much that, but Quebec voted to stay rather than to leave, opposite of what the United Kingdom did with the EU. And the 95 referendum is really notable because there was a 93% voter turnout. And if you don't pay attention to voter turnouts, that is shockingly high. A good voter turnout for a federal election is somewhere in the 60 to 70%. So 93% voter turnout is incredible. But it also revealed very deep loyalty divides within the people of Quebec. And reflecting on this has always been a complicated thing because there are still lingering questions about whether or not the way that the referendum question was worded was confusing. It was certainly wrapped up in a lot of legalese, which could have confused some people about what was this actually asking. It wasn't simply, should Quebec stay as part of Canada or leave Canada, even though that was the intent behind it. This is also, again, if we contrast this with the Brexit vote, it's kind of the opposite problem that Brexit had. Brexit had the problem of, well, should we leave or should we go? And that's basically all that was on there. And there was no forethought put into what does that actually look like? What are the consequences of this? So a referendum like this is fraught with a lot of difficulty. Another one happened a couple of years ago in Scotland as well, should it remain part of the UK, and they did vote to remain part of the UK, although now in a post-Brexit world, that one's back up in the air again. So contending loyalties are a difficult thing for people to deal with, and you can see that leaving a nation state's not an easy thing, even when people have very powerful feelings around it. So it's a complex and challenging situation.